Hello, ladies. Good day, and I hope you're all doing very well. Today, we shall be looking at our first topic, that is diversity of living things, and that is we shall look at classification. And then we are going to look at only the first part of it. In our subsequent lessons, we shall look at the other areas under this particular topic. Let us now look at our lesson objectives for the day. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to 1. Explain the term biological classification. 2. You should be able to state and explain the contributions of some scientists in the classification of living things. Then 3. You should be able to explain why it is important to classify living things. We shall now look at diversity and, of course, zoom to look at biodiversity. When I say about diversity, now this refers to the differences that exist between things. Yeah, so we have several things in the world, and then there are differences that exist between them. And so there is an English word that means differences that exist between things. Now we can bring this to a biological field, and then we say that biodiversity refers to the differences that exist between organisms or living things of the same species. Now there are several living things, there are several organisms, and then all these organisms don't look the same. They look different in so many ways. If we pick animals, for instance, looking at all animals, there are several differences between all animals that we have. And so there is a need for us to group them and then sort them. And that's how come we're also going to look at classification. When the classification, now this refers to sorting and putting things into groups or categories based on their common or basic characteristics or features. I realize that several things, like we said earlier, they look different in so many ways, and so there is a need for us to classify them. Now, looking at Alright, so we are bringing this back to a biological field, and then we look at the differences that exist between classification and a biological classification. The two words are actually different in a few ways. Now, earlier we said classification refers to sorting and putting things into groups based on their common characteristics. Now, biological classification here therefore refer to the act of sorting and putting living things into groups or categories based on their common characteristics. Now, I must note that the bottom line, the difference that we are looking for here is that for classification we generalize it, that is things. And when we say things, it means everything. But under biological classification, we are referring to only living things. So here we are grouping, or we are sorting and grouping living things into various categories or various groups based on their common or basic characteristics. Alright, so now let's look at what is taxonomy. Now this is the branch of biology that is concerned with the principles of classification based on structural, genetic, and then cellular organization. And so the people who study taxonomy are called taxonomists. And so in our earlier slide, in our subsequent slides, you'll be seeing some taxonomies that I'm going to discuss. We'll be discussing a few of them, and you'll see who they are and what they really did. We shall now look at the history of classification. Now, there are several scientists who contributed to classifying living things. And we shall look at just a few. We will talk about Aristotle, we will talk about Carolus Linnaeus. Now, Aristotle, he was a Greek philosopher and a biologist, and then he was one of the earliest taxonomists. In fact, the first person who classified living things. He lived between the years 322 to 384 BC, that is before Christ. Aristotle, he put all living things into two main groups, that is plants and of course animals. That is how Aristotle classified or grouped all living things. Now, for animals, he based his classification on whether the animals have red blood or not. Now, he also grouped them based on their habitat, that is where they live, and also how they move. And based on this, Aristotle classified animals into three groups. That is, those animals that can fly. So he looked at the birds, those that can fly. He also looked at those that can move on land. So talking about some mammals that can move on land, some reptiles that move on land. We also group them into those that can swim in water, that is the fishes, basically, the aquatic organisms. Now for plants, he used the appearance and then the size as the basis for classifying the plants. Now based on this, he grouped them into three main categories. That is the plants with soft stems, he called them herbs, and also the plants with several small woody stems. When I say woody stems, the stem that looks like wood or that are woody, they look like wood. And also he called those ones the shrubs. Then of course, lastly, those with single and then tall woody stems, he called them trees, like the mahogany, the mango, and so on and so forth. But then Aristotle had some shortcomings or some demerits. His mode of classification failed to explain the relationship that exists between organisms. And so this is one of the disadvantages of Aristotle's classification. But then we give him credit because he set the precedence upon which other scientists built upon for classifying living things. Now we shall look at another scientist who also contributed massively to classifying living things. Now he is Carolus Linnaeus. He lived between the years of 1707 to 1778. Now he was a Swedish botanist. He was from Sweden, and he studied plants. He was a botanist. Now he is considered to be the father of modern taxonomy, and this is because he developed the system of classification that we are using today. Now this system of classification is known as the natural system of classification. Now for Linnaeus, he used structural similarities between organisms to classify them. That is, he classified plants and animals based on their body plan, looking at their body features, their body anatomy, what the plants do have in common. And that is what he used to classify living things. Let us now look at the importance of classification. Now, the very first importance we shall look at is for easy identification of organisms. Now, scientists, so as to easily identify organisms, they need to classify them, sort them, that is to sort them, and then put them into groups based on their common or basic characteristics. Now, from the beginning, you realize that organisms are so diverse in many ways. They look very different in so many ways, and so for us to easily identify them, then there is a need for us to classify them. That is to sort them and then put them into groups and based on their basic or common characteristics. Now, we also classify them so as to study them easily. I realize that scientists normally do study organisms, and without classifying them, we can't study them. And there is a need for us to classify organisms so as to easily study them, so that we know that these organisms belong to mammals, the mammal category, they belong to the reptile category, they belong to the bird category, so as we can easily study them. And lastly, classifying organisms helps to establish the evolutionary relationship between organisms of different species. As we all know, scientists do say that human beings evolved from apes. Now, classification of organisms helps us to establish the relationship that exists between organisms and then the organisms that they evolved from. And that's the reason why scientists do classify organisms. Now, these are the various reasons or the various importance of classifying organisms. Now, let us delve deeper into Linnaeus' mode of classification. Now, according to Linnaeus, he grouped living things into seven main ranks or seven main categories, which we call taxa. Singularly is taxon. Now, there are seven taxa of classification that was named by lineals, and these include, you have the first one, which is kingdom, you have the phylum, you have the class, you have the order, you have the family, the genus, and lastly we have the species. So there are 7 taxa or 7 ranks or categories of classification, and these are they. Now let's first look at what the kingdom is. Now the kingdom is the largest or the broadest taxon of living things. And this means that in a kingdom, we have the largest number of individuals or organisms. So a kingdom takes the largest number of organisms within itself. Now all living things are classified or grouped into 5 main kingdoms. So we're going to look at the 5 kingdom system that was proposed or propounded by Carolus Linnaeus. We have kingdom Animalia, and this kingdom comprised of all animals. We have kingdom Plantae, that is all plants belong to this kingdom. We have kingdom Fungi, as all the fungi, including mushroom, puffballs, tinea, all belong to this kingdom. We have kingdom Protista or Protoctista, and all the protists belong to this particular kingdom as well. We also have the last one, kingdom Prokaryote, and all these are the 5 kingdom systems that Linnaeus proposed or propounded. Now, each kingdom is also subdivided into a smaller subunit or a subdivision that we call the phylum. Yeah, so like we said earlier, the phylum is a subdivision or a smaller group, a subgroup under the kingdom. One must note that organisms in the same phylum look much more alike. They look much more similar in their body plan and characteristics than those in the same kingdom. We have to note this. And also, when we are looking at the kingdom Plantae and the kingdom Fungi, we don't use the term phylum for it, but rather use the term division for in place of phylum. So one must note that one. So, however, you also have to note that each phylum or division is also subdivided into smaller groups or smaller units or taxon called the class. Yeah, so for a class, it is also another subdivision or another subgroup that is found under the phylum. And in this particular phylum, organisms here they share more common characteristics than those in the same phylum. It means that they have very common features, they share lots of common characteristics among themselves, and then it makes them look much more alike than organisms in the same class. And so we can look at class Insecta or insects. So they belong to the same class because of this they share very common characteristics. We can even look at class Amphibia or the amphibians belonging to the same class, class Reptilia or the reptiles, class Mammalia or the mammals belonging to the same class, and you realize that they share much more common characteristics as compared to organisms in the same phylum. Now, one must also note that each class is also subdivided into smaller groups that we normally call the order. Now, for the order, like we said, another subdivision of a class. So a smaller unit that is under the class. And over here, so you see that we are going down in the taxon. We are going down within the taxa. So it means that over here, organism number also reduces, and then organisms here show more resemblance than those in the same class. They show much more resemblance than those in the same class. Like for instance, order Dictyoptera, like order Orthoptera with the insects class, and so on and so forth. So you have to note this one. Now, under this particular taxon, we also have subdivisions under it, which we call the family, also under it. Now, so the family also being a subdivision of the order. In this particular taxon, organisms also show much more resemblance than those in the same order. So like I said, as we move down the taxon, similarity increases. Number of organisms also does what? Does decrease. So let's take note of this one. Then the last but one is the genus. The genus, as we see, another subdivision or another smaller rank or smaller unit that is under the family. And so under these, you can have organisms that are looking very much alike. They look so much alike than those in the same family. Now, in this particular rank, organisms, even though they are closely related, they can't interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. So let's take note of this one. So they are clearly related anyway, but then they can't interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Now under this particular rank or taxon, we have the last unit that is under it, which we call the species. So for a species, that's the smallest rank, that's the smallest taxon, and the most important unit in classifying living things. Now members of this particular rank have very common characteristics. They look so much alike, and then for these ones they can actually interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. So you can take all human beings belong to the same species, you can take all mongoose belong to the same species. So this is what we call the species. Now one can, however, define a species as a group of closely related individuals or organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. Yeah, so thank you. This is the end of the first part of our lesson, that is classification. In our next lesson, we shall continue with this particular topic. That will be the part 2 of classification. Here are a few questions for you to take home. Try this once, and then you submit them. So you have the first question here. So you have to explain the term biological classification. Now the first question, you also have to explain how the following scientists classified living things. That is, so you have Aristotle, you also have Carolus Linnaeus. So you have to explain how they classified living things. Then number 3, you have to state 3 importance of classification. Tell us why it is important to classify living things. And then lastly, define the term species. See you in the next lesson. Bye bye.